Hello, welcome to another installment of Click for Course, brought to you by Grand Canyon University's Canyon Professional Development. And today we are going to look at science integration, how we can teach ELA and science. And we're going to focus in specifically on grades 3 through 5 today. So we want to take a look at, instead of just teaching these two subjects at separate times, how can we purposefully integrate both of these topics together and make them both more meaningful for each other. And yes, my name is Cece Bosma, and I'm so glad to be here with you today. I am part of the Canyon K-12 professional development team. I have been in the field of education for at least 15 years. So I hope I get to pass along some of the things that I've learned over the years and help you build that substantial science program in your own classroom in the 3 to 5 grades. And I like to start with a quote, and this one is from William Lawrence Bragg. And you might be saying, well, who is William Lawrence Bragg? He is a physicist from well over a century ago, or he was here up until I think like the 70s. But he is the youngest person to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics. Back when he was 25, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics. And one of the statements that has stood the test of time is that he says, the important thing in science is not so much to obtain new facts as to discover new ways of thinking about them. And certainly we know in our modern times, we don't need to, it's not a sit and get. We don't want to shove just a bunch of information into our students' heads and have them regurgitate that to us, right? Instead, we want them to use the scientific knowledge that they gain, to use the knowledge that they gain in any of their subjects to help them answer questions and solve problems and come up with solutions to help the world around us, right? So I love William Lawrence Bragg's statement here, because we want to move beyond those facts and get to really interacting with each other and with the world around us. How are we thinking? So in order to get us there, let's take a look at those objectives. We're going to develop an understanding of how ELA standards can complement those science standards. They work really well together. We don't need to keep them in silos. And then I'm just going to kind of briefly walk you through a lesson plan where I've integrated specifically those ELA and science standards together, as well as giving you the opportunity to start building your own lesson plan so that you can get used to this idea and have something to start with to bring back to your classroom and try out for yourself. All right. And I like to have the takeaway up here at the end. We're going to, this will reappear to kind of jog your memory about what are you going to take away from our time together today. So to get us going, we want to talk about sense making, because science is all about sense making, and sense making in science describes those unique tasks required for learning science. And they're woven within those tasks are those literacy skills that are specific to science. New science standards have been developed over the last decade to align learning science with doing science, just like scientists. And we need to prepare the next generation of scientists, whether they work in a lab or develop the next life-saving drug. Maybe they're going to be on the next space mission or design a breakthrough business practice. It would be hard to find a job that doesn't require some sort of skills that require sense making in the near future. And the process requires students to engage in the in nature and the natural and designed world, and ask questions and learn why things are the way they are, what makes things work. So then taking a look at that literacy in science. In order to do science like a scientist, it is really necessary to include ELA skills. We can't do science without some English language arts. To functionally process that information and the ideas and discover why and what is going on in the world. And this can be broken down into 3 main categories. Before we can speak, we need to listen and listen for understanding. And when we are processing our new ideas, they should be shared. And this is through conversation, oral communication of those findings. And writing is necessary for recording new ideas. We might want to graphically organize our thoughts and observations and share the findings that we have discovered. And reading is also, of course, a crucial component of learning science. It is necessary to learn what other scientists have determined and learn more about the phenomena, often from multiple sources. And that includes being able to understand the nuances of science literature and build a science vocabulary, as well as synthesize information from multiple sources. And it is through these ELA practices that students are going to develop into scientists. A language tool is for learning. Contextualized learning experiences in science will help to build students' language skills, as well as subject-specific literacy skills. Instead of teaching ELA at one time and science at another, it is possible to improve ELA and science learning by combining both subjects intentionally into one cohesive lesson or possibly unit. While science literacy is part of a general literacy skills, it's hard to build the subject-specific skills needed to do science like a scientist without intentionally teaching science literacy. While science investigations, observations, research, and development happen in many different ways, we can be sure that in the elementary science classroom, we will do well to expose our young scientists to doing science by introducing foundational tasks. And this begins with observing phenomena. We can do this in many different ways, from watching a video, observing pictures, perhaps a place-based field trip to see the phenomena in person. No matter what method of observation is used, it is important to record observations. Using OWL, which we'll get into in a minute, is just one way to do this. Through observations, we develop questions that drive the exploration. And one way that we can begin to find answers is to access those multiple sources of information. And this could be textbooks, journal articles, videos, but there are numerous scientific resources that we can use to find out what has been discovered previously and begin to find answers to those driving questions. As students work as scientists, scientific vocabulary is also key to building that scientific literacy. It is necessary for instance, in science, acceleration means the rate at which velocity changes with time in both speed and direction. So there's these nuances with the vocabulary that we have to be really specific with scientific vocabulary. So it's just a bit more detailed than their day-to-day exposure to some of the vocabulary. And once students have observed and recorded their findings, it is through clear synthesis and analysis of collected data and research that students will share their findings through written reports, perhaps graphic organizers. Maybe they're going to have oral presentations, but science is about recording and sharing findings. That's how real scientists do it. And we have to build communication skills for all of these components are required for building science literacy. So throughout the remainder of this, I'm going to weave together how we can incorporate science and ELA. And as we do this step by step, we're going to see through a short vignette here that I'm going to share with you about building in literacy and science and building those ELA together. And we're going to start with Charlotte's Web. We can do this in a number of different ways. You could start with the science and then incorporate the story, or you can start with the story and perhaps incorporate the science. I just for the sake of this one, we're going to start with the story. So yes, you can use Charlotte's Web as a starting point. It creates a connection between something that they know, which is that story of Wilbur and Charlotte, and we can include that science of adaptations and of living things. As we know, connecting new learning and making it relevant is important for engaging students. In Charlotte's Web, there are numerous animals that create a great launch on studying animal adaptation. Now, because Charlotte Web is fictional, it is important to make that clear to our students. Such things as talking spiders that can write are certainly make-believe, and we want to make sure for our younger students that we make that clear to them. But as much as there is some fantastical fantasy fiction within Charlotte's Web, there's also some great realistic fiction details about the animals in the story. And so we can use that as sort of a connection. And then from there, we're going to bring in, for the sake of this, I'm bringing in this picture of a web. And we're going to use that to introduce phenomena. And it's sometimes the most readily available way to share phenomena is through a picture. But be as creative as possible, because videos, we can use demonstrations, scientific demonstrations. We could, that place-based, that actual viewing. If I was doing this at school, I might take the students out and go find a web somewhere on the school campus where they can really observe firsthand what's going on with a spider web. Just be careful, it's not a black widow spider web. But that's, one of those safety rules in science, and that's another module for another day of how we can make sure we keep things safe. So for this lesson, I would invite students to observe the web. And when we talk about phenomena, before we get too far down the road of this lesson, we want to be careful what we choose. Which of these pictures do you think is the better choice for learning about condensation and evaporation? If you chose the water bottle, I would agree with you on that. While the other picture is quite fabulous, most students will think that they are looking at smoke and not steam. And there is quite a lot going on in that picture. Unless the students have visited a seaport, they probably have no experience with large ships. So we probably want to steer clear from the phenomenal phenomena, and stick with something that the students can connect with and relate to. If I was doing this in my own classroom, I would probably skip the picture altogether and just bring in a bottle of water, right? I think that's the best way. Anytime we can make something three-dimensional versus two-dimensional, let's go for it. And sometimes it is, and a lot of times it is as simple as a bottle of water. So don't let the lack of science resources keep you from thinking that you can't incorporate some great phenomena in your own classroom and make the science meaningful for your students. Take some time, now that we've gone into our entry event and looked at our phenomena, I want you to take some time to consider what you are reading in ELA that connects in some way with science. Get creative here. Consider earth science, topics such as erosion and weather. There's space science, including the phases of the moon and the Earth's rotation and revolution, or perhaps life science. It covers so many topics about plants and animals, even bacteria. There's also physical science. So there are often connections that can be made with fictional stories or perhaps an expository piece of work. If you start with a fictional story, you will want to consider how you're going to introduce the scientific literacy necessary for students to gain working scientific knowledge of the subject. So that will require other readings as well. So pause the video here, and using your chosen lesson template, whether it's the one that I've provided here on the screen, as you can see, I created this very simple lesson flow template. I wanted to keep it simple because I know that, hopefully you're here because you want to learn more about integrating science with English language arts, because oftentimes in the elementary classroom, English language arts and math take precedence and science is pushed to the side. The other problem that sometimes occurs, or the other barrier, is the idea that science is all about hands-on. And while it certainly is, to do science like a scientist, we really want to bring in those ELA components that will support doing science like a scientist. So take a minute and pause the video here and consider what your entry event's going to be, if you have a piece of literature that you're going to connect it with, or if you have some other entry event that you'd like to use. And then think about, what is that phenomena going to look like? What phenomena are you going to engage the students in to start generating some questions? And we'll go into how that phenomena is used next. Pause your video when you're finished with those two things. Come right back. So before we get too far, I want to go into the standards. And you might say, well, I'd rather start with the standards, and you certainly can. But we want to make sure that we ground the work that we're doing in standards that are applicable to our grade level. And so with any lesson that we start, we need to start with some standards. And for this lesson that is springboarding off of Charlotte's Web, I said, hey, this is a great book that ties in well with animal adaptations, animal traits. And I consulted the science standards in Arizona. That's what I am most familiar with. And I'm sure many of you that will watch this video might be from Arizona. Maybe you're from another state. They are similar. You'll probably find similar standards for yourselves. So I went through and looked at what were the connecting standards for each grade level, and I was actually able to find some. And then we also want to consider how we can engage students in reading, writing, listening, and speaking for that authentic science exploration. And so I took a look at our ELA standards and found the ones that I thought complemented and would be used almost to the point of maybe not mastery, but would be heavily utilized and would be helping our students work towards mastery on those ELA standards, and that they complemented the science standards. So as you can see here, for third grade, they want the students to develop and use models to explain plants and animals, how they have internal and external structures. And those are characteristics. They're also called traits, and they're also considered adaptations, both behaviors and physical traits, right? And as you look at that standard, remember, with our science standards, they're deep. So yes, it says to create a model. And at some point in the unit, you will get to the point where you create a model. We're not going to do that in this short lesson. But in order to create the model, we have to find out more information and create more knowledge with our students around the topic. And in helping to do that, we're going to describe the relationships between those scientific ideas or concepts, and use language that pertains to cause and effect, time, and sequence. So we want to hone in on those things for our students. If you're in the fourth grade, analyze and interpret environmental data to demonstrate that species either adapt, there's that word, and survive, or go extinct. So what are some of these adaptations that keep animals from going extinct? That's going to require, on the ELA side, interpreting information presented visually, orally, or quantitatively. So we want to get our students looking at charts and creating some of those investigations. And then in the 5th grade, construct an explanation based on evidence that changes in the environment can affect the development of traits in a population of organisms. And that's tying very closely into that idea of adaptations. And so to help with building that scientific knowledge, we're going to take a look at the ELA standard of drawing evidence from informational texts to support analysis, reflection, and research. And it says applying grade 5 reading standards to literature. We can do that here, right? And informational text. So we're going to want to make sure that we bring in informational text into our investigation. We want to make sure we have those standards connected. So before we get too far down a rabbit hole, it's important to connect your story to science and ELA standards. So I created the example here, and I just took what I put on that previous screen and plugged them in to the template that I created. This is at the bottom of the template. What I want you to do is pause the video and go and investigate your own science and ELA standards and become familiar with those and look for the standards that are going to complement the story that you've chosen and work well in building that science and ELA integrated lesson. When you're ready, come back and we'll continue. Entry event, we have our phenomena chosen. We know what standards that we're working on with our investigation here that started with Charlotte's Web and then moved into looking at a spider web. We now want to develop, what are we going to do? So we have our kids looking at a spider web. Now what? Well, what we can start with is what I love to use in my class. It's called OWL. If you've ever heard of KWL, it's like that, but I think it's even better. And we replace that what we know with an O for what we're observing. And we can really craft this to accomplish a number of different things. In this, students get to observe. So everybody's starting at an even playing field. It's not about what they already happen to know, if they got to go see a spider web when they were on their last vacation or something like that. We want to give our students that equal playing field. And so we start with observe. And one of the ways that we can help them observe and tie in those ELA skills is like what I put here, how we could say, hey, what nouns describe what you are seeing? And then they can write that down in their science notebook. What verbs are describing the behaviors that you see? Is the spider web bouncing? Is there a spider in the spider web? Or is there, sadly, the spider's prey in the spider web? Maybe a fly got stuck in there. I don't know. But we can find those observations. And then the observations are going to lead to those questions. Why did the fly get stuck in the spider web? How does a spider use a spider web? These kinds of questions are going to be generated by your students. And then after the research, and as you're moving through the lesson, through the unit, you're going to come back to that learn phase and continue to add to that until you've finished or completed the unit, right? So the L, we leave that to the side for later in the lesson. So now that we have our OWL, we want our students to develop a driving question. During the OWL exercise, students developed questions that they had about that phenomena. And with our standards in mind, we want to develop what is often referred to as a driving question. And this question will drive or guide the research and investigations. Pull from the student-developed questions that will help them focus on the standards. For our example, our standard is focused on traits, structure, and adaptation of living things that are necessary for survival. Keep this in mind as you develop your driving question or questions. If this is new to you, stick to one driving question. But as you become more familiar, you might want to group your students with similar driving questions. The small groups can find answers to their questions and then share out. And this, of course, requires that students communicate both in writing and orally. And you can see how, once again, we can purposefully integrate ELA into learning about science. And think about those driving questions. They should not be yes or no answers. I like to say that they shouldn't be Googleable. I know that's a big word, right? I think I made it up. We want it to be broad enough that it requires research, investigation, problem solving, and maybe some experimentation to develop an answer. I have several iterations of the driving question. So we can see, do spiders need webs? Well, that's an easy yes or no question. We don't want to add that. That's not enough to really get an investigation going. How do spiders spin webs? Well, that's an interesting question, but it's a little bit off task from our standard that we're trying to accomplish. So we're probably not going to go after that question either. How do spiders benefit from being able to produce a web? Now we're taking a look at how does this adaptation help a spider survive? And maybe that's the question, as simple as how does a spider webs act as an adaptation to help a spider survive? That could be your question too, and that would be fine as well. But we always want to make sure that we have a driving question that motivates students to find more information to help them answer that question. And then that brings us to research. And in the research part of science, we can put those ELA skills to work. We want to provide students with books, journals, videos, and podcasts that they can find more information about the topic. And this could be by looking on the web as well. And I like to use News ELA, or News ELA, as a lot of people like to call it. It's a great resource if you have not tapped into that one yet. It has articles that cover numerous topics, not just science, but all kinds of current news, historical topics, science topics, and just anything you can imagine. And the great thing about it is that oftentimes the articles come with some activities, some questions to help students focus on the article, and the articles come in several different reading levels. So you don't have to just stick to one reading level. If you've got students at different reading levels in your classroom, they can be reading the same article at their reading level. Isn't that fantastic? So for this activity, I had students read, "Spiders can take down and feast on surprisingly big snakes." And I found that article on News ELA. As we know, there are many animals in the story of Charlotte's Web, and students may want to investigate the traits of other animals, and that's fine too. Don't be afraid to let them sort of within reason follow what they're interested in, and that will help to motivate the learning. This is a great topic that can get students looking around the school for other insects and spiders and recording some firsthand observations. This might even include small animals such as mice or even snakes. With caution, you could look for those holes in the ground. Why do they burrow in the ground? Creating a terrarium might be another investigation, to be sure, to have students recording notes about their findings so that they can refer to them during the analysis phase. Keep in mind that during research, You can keep this as guided or open-ended as you choose. Students can look for their own research if they have experience. This might be more appropriate at that 5th grade level. But no matter what you do with your students, if it's brand new to them, model, model, model. If they've never taken notes before, model note taking. If they've never recorded their observations, model recording observations. And then complete the lesson as a whole group with whole group instruction, and be very precise about modeling every step. And you'll probably have to model every step for probably through at least a few iterations before the students are able to start doing some of it by themselves. So now it is your turn. It's a great idea to start with a driving question. And while hopefully students will develop a workable driving question, develop your own that will help you as you guide their thinking. You will want to consider what further research your students will engage in and draft a concrete plan. Finally, what steps are your students going to take? Are they recording information in a notebook? Will you design a worksheet to help them reflect and make connections with the reading? Pause the video and take some time to flesh out the particulars of your lesson. Consider the guiding questions that you'll want to make sure that are answered, what type of research you're going to incorporate, and how your students are going to record their findings. Pause the video when you're ready and you've answered those questions to your satisfaction. Come on back. Science vocabulary. As students develop their thinking on the science topic, it is crucial for building science vocabulary. As mentioned earlier, science vocabulary is very much discipline specific. Consider what method you will use in order for students to build science vocabulary. This can be done with an anchor chart or a word wall. When students are assigned a specific article to read or a trade book, be sure to take time during each reading to pick out that vocabulary that is crucial for understanding. Provide students time to build their definitions of the vocabulary. If you're creating a word wall, invite students to write their definitions for the words, and that can be done by using some of those reading skills, extracting the embedded definitions in the reading. Use graphic organizers such as a Freyer model. That can help our students gain the crucial knowledge about the scientific specific vocabulary. Engage and involve students in building their knowledge. As students move into the analysis step, guide them to use that vocabulary as they complete their analysis. So speaking of analysis, so at some point we have to start we've introduced them to these ideas. We've given them a lot of research. Perhaps they did an investigation beyond just reading. And now, they got to get out there in the field and observe firsthand different adaptations of animals that are near to the classroom. And now it's time to analyze. So we go back to that driving question of how do webs help spiders survive, right? And we read the article, and the article told us about how spiders can actually capture quite large things, including snakes, and that's how they get their food. And the webs are a rather useful tool and very much necessary for the survival of the spiders that weave those webs. And analysis may seem like it's exclusive to science, but it's actually found directly in English language arts standards. It's a skill that is used across many disciplines. Science is cyclical learning, in that analysis will lead to new questions that you might have time to investigate. You may not have time. You might have to just kind of stop it and move on to the next standard that needs to be addressed. Once students have completed the research phase, it's time for analysis. And this is another opportunity to directly address ELA standards. In the analysis phase, we want students to synthesize their learning and share what they have learned as it relates to the driving question. And this requires an analysis of what was read, data charts, and other sources of information. A CER is simply a system of creating a claim and backing it up with evidence, and then tying the two pieces together through a reasoning statement. This strategy can be used in any subject, but works well with science. And the answers to the driving question is the claim. So when we write that claim, we're writing an answer to the driving question. And then that is supported by the evidence found in the research phase. And so, for this one, the students read the article about the snakes that were captured in the spider's web. And so we can say, yes, the web is definitely an adaptation that a spider needs for survival. It's how they capture their food. And we can base that on the evidence of spiders even being able to capture snakes, and then having the ability to immobilize the snake and eat the snake in a roundabout way, if you will. So based on the evidence, students are going to prepare and share their ideas. And this is a great tool for students to use. And it prepares them to move away from feelings, because science isn't so much about feelings. It is about based on facts, based on observations. So we kind of want to leave those feelings out of it. And rather, we're going to rely on that knowledge that we've gained from sound research. So now is your turn. Consider what methods you will use for processing new vocabulary. And you can refer in the reference list. I have posted a web resource that will walk you through different ways of working with scientific vocabulary. So there's a number of different ways that we could have our students engage with vocabulary. And then consider what tool you will use for students to explain their answers to the driving question. And finally, how will your students share their findings? As you consider this, reflect on the ELA skills that can be built in here. Do you want them to give an oral presentation or a written presentation? So pause the video and develop the vocabulary tools and how that looks in your lesson plan, as well as that analysis for the information. Are you going to use a CER? Perhaps you're going to go with argument from evidence. And that could be more of an oral presentation. That might be easier for some of the younger students, although it could be a challenge for the shy ones. So you have to think about that and how that might look. Maybe you give students a choice. Anyway, pause the video and develop your vocabulary part of the lesson and your analysis part of the lesson. So now that you've had a chance to sort of piece together, I know I gave you a very simple sort of vignette planning guide, very loose. I don't want to overcomplicate it. This is definitely meant to be sort of introductory if you're not real familiar with teaching science. And so thinking about this, we've chosen our science topic. We've found those reading, writing, and listening, speaking skills that we can incorporate into the plan. We've chosen our phenomena. We know what research that we're going to have our students do, how that's going to look. Is it going to be reading? Is it going to be a hands-on investigation? We have thought about how we're going to intentionally integrate vocabulary into the lesson. How is that going to look? Are we going to create a word wall? Are students going to use a Freire model in their science notebook? What are we going to do? And then we have an analysis, a conclusion, if you will. We know what the students are going to do with all this information they've gathered. How are they going to answer the driving question? And I, certainly using a claim evidence reasoning practice is a great way to do that. You could also look at having students create an argument from the evidence. What are your takeaways? I hope that you have some. I hope that you'll go back to your class, and I know that oftentimes science just doesn't make, there's not a lot of time for it, but if we integrate science into ELA, we can find that time to make science really interesting, and by doing so, making English language arts really interesting for our students. If we can give them that actual application of English language arts in the study of science. And by doing so, we've built up both subjects simultaneously. So what are your takeaways? Please review the attached resources too. And those are in the reference sheet and then the resource sheet that's below that. And try integrating science and ELA right away. Your students are going to love it. And we want to empower, educate, and inspire you to take action to fulfill your purpose and serve others. We cannot do this without you. As STEM educators, you have the power to influence the next generation of STEM and science professionals. And also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for hundreds of free professional development videos to support teachers, students, and administrators. And this is a free resource, so please do take advantage and subscribe now. And then we also have connecting with Canyon PD on social media, access free resources, and interact with our team and find out more about upcoming events. Thank you for joining me today.